You have 5 minutes whenever you're ready, and the clock is over there.
Got it. So I don't usually read straight from a piece of paper or something I've written, but in the interest of staying within 5 minutes, because I have so much to say, I'm going to do my best to try to get it all in. I've got it here. So Christine Hubbard, I'm Operations Manager at Beck Taxi. I've been participating in what seems like an ongoing review since 2011. It's still obviously not done. Government regulation, as we know it, is the minimum standard. I think everyone can agree on that. We know this because participants in a regulated industry are not allowed to do less than the standards set by government, but they can choose to do more. Minimum standards tend to increase when it comes to public safety, accessibility, and environmental protections. Examples include changes to the trucking industry and requirements for technology companies recently. For some reason, the vehicle for hire industry seems to be the only one moving in the opposite direction. The existing bylaw and this report being reviewed today make that clear. In 1998, a review was initiated as a result of concern regarding vehicle safety and driver training directly related to public and worker safety. The City of Toronto realized that there was a lack of municipal oversight. Logically, the minimum standard was raised. Vehicle inspections had to be done at the city's inspection facility on Eastern Avenue every 6 months, including a mechanical and condition of vehicle inspection. Age of vehicles was cut in half, and a 17-day course was introduced to anyone who wanted to be licensed not just to drive, because there is a difference. This is not your provincial driver's license, but to cruise Toronto streets, navigating bike lane infrastructure, approaching curbside consistently. Sensitivity and accessibility training, along with knowing how to get to important locations like hospitals, this is necessary as representatives of our city. Mandatory refresher training was required every few years as well. This is the kind of policy that protects people, riders, drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, and other road users. None of this came at any cost to the city. In fact, it created jobs for city employees under a model of cost recovery paid for by the very people who were being licensed. In 2016, in the name of so-called innovation, the clock was turned back on these items to pre-1998. Training canceled, inspection station closed, in favor of what they had found substandard previously, back to basic safety certificates, and even worse than before, now we just send a photograph or a scanned image of that safety certificate. The bar has been lowered. Somehow the minimum standard on safety and public protection has been lowered further by this report when it comes to, again, safety, but also the environment. The city has set goals for lowering emissions, and rather than apply the environmental requirement for sedans, for taxi sedans, to all vehicles for hire, instead they've removed it from those that were actually mandated in the first place. Leveling the playing field, let's just not even use that term anymore. We know that's out the window, so let's just not. I'm stunned. I'm stunned by this report, I have to admit. It's vague at best. Things like training being mentioned, but without any clarification. I understand that PTC companies are looking for the path of least resistance. That is evidence, there's evidence everywhere to support that. But defensive driving has to be learned in a car. Safety and human rights related training has to be done in person. If customer service is online, that's fine. I know it took them long enough to even allow tips in their app, so if they want to lose that, that's fine. What is down to the penny here is the wheelchair accessibility strategy. This piece seems to be very in-depth, while everything else is hardly mentioned. During consultations, we were told that a cap on the number of vehicles was being reviewed. It's happening now in New York City, not even mentioned in this report. For the accessibility strategy, I must say, I don't call myself a numbers person, but the math just doesn't work out. To my knowledge, there are 550 TTL or wheelchair accessible licenses, and a budget collected strictly from the members of this industry at $5 million a year outlines $2,800 for each operator, with the opportunity for an additional $1,800. This is less than half of the amount being collected. Less than half of the amount being collected. Where's the rest of this money going? I went to the accessibility consultations along with TTL driver consultations, and at every meeting there was a discussion of the idea that TTL vehicles were not being utilized properly. Hundreds of them either working independently as standard cabs or part of brokerages that had no platform for connection. It's widely agreed by members of the disabled community, advocates and attendants, that people should have access to all TTL vehicles, perhaps through an app where orders for this service would take priority. People would be well served by this. Instead, there's a fund that doesn't begin to answer any of the problems. The vehicles are falling apart. We heard from drivers and riders that they're not comfortable in the vehicles. Here's the problem. The strategy will fail. Total destabilization of this service is what I see in this report. Even if they get the maximum amount allowable, it's not enough. for them to replace those vehicles, and they're not going to do it. There's also no mention of wheelchair accessible training in this report. It doesn't make any sense. It's not strong enough. I'm asking it for this report to be taken back for clarification. The accessibility strategy looks generous on the cover, but it's not. The training, it's just mentioned with no detail. Lack of interest in the environment is frankly atrocious, and the safety in PTC vehicles by way of no need for cameras. So instead, we'll re-victimize victims by working with the he said, she said scenario. Having Toronto, PTC companies will sign a waiver that holds Toronto innocent in any of these situations. So I read that as well.
Sorry,
Please take a
Christine, I
chance
need you
to
to
look at
wrap
the
up.
Ryerson report that was released today as well.
Thank you. Questions to the deputant? So I just wanted, sorry, no question to the deputant? So I just wanted to ask for the percentage of vehicles that are wheelchair accessible.
Right.
So right now, my understanding is, so the taxi cab fleet's about 13%, PTCs are 0.042,
Yeah.
and limousines are at 0.
Yeah, I think there was an update that was released a couple of days ago that it's actually 8 to 11% instead of 13. Did I read that, Carlton? I think there was an adjustment to the, anyway.
Yeah, so
Yes.
would you,
Yeah.
from Beck Taxi's perspective, what's an acceptable level? Is 13% acceptable
I
for
absolutely.
all three categories,
So
or?
if, for example, if you look at our fleet, we've got about 1,900 vehicles altogether, but 145 are TTL or wheelchair on demand. We still struggle to reach that on-demand equitable service, and it's not easy. And what we're doing now, so for every time we dispatch a wheelchair accessible trip, we're subsidizing the first $10 of that trip. So we're of course charging the customer the same amount as they'd pay in a standard taxi, but we're also paying them an additional $10 because we know this system is not sustainable. But worse than that, in the winter, and there's one of our hopefully present, but I think past customers here who waited, and we couldn't get that wheelchair accessible vehicle, except the fact that there are 500 of them around the city. If we had access to all of those, we'd have no problem. The idea that it's compartmentalized into different companies who are each working with 100 here, 100 there, it's completely inefficient, it's completely unfair. I'd say that, the idea in the beginning that we would have a pool of all these vehicles so that people would actually be able to access the accessible vehicles makes sense. And there's no mention of that. Every meeting I went to, we all talked about it. Everyone seemed to believe that that would be a path forward, and that would be what's, the most equitable way forward, not even mentioned in the report.
Okay, all right.
So 13% is enough, but they all have to be able to be accessed. There are hundreds of them operating as though they're independent cabs right now, not doing any wheelchair accessible work, or are parts of, as the last deputant said, members of a 5-vehicle brokerage. Come on. Nobody's accessing that. They're not helping anyone. So the idea that they aren't part of, still maintain those smaller connections. If someone wants to drive with Beck Taxi, but the priority would be those trips coming through that app or what have you, so that people can access all of the vehicles, not just, they shouldn't have to call 6 different companies and hope that one shows up.
Right, and I can go to the Yellow Pages and call a company that will come and pick me up that's not a licensed taxi cab.
That's right. Yeah, and then so the alternative is an unregulated, unlicensed, uninspected, who knows what. But if that's the only company that can do that work, they're going to use it because they don't have the choice. And the idea that we don't offer people choice is frightening.
Okay, all right, thank you.